Okay, this is my presentation about the French and Indian War. Before we get to the French and Indian War, which was also called the Seven-Year War, and it was called the Seven-Year War in England, and America it was called the French and Indian Wars, you have to understand the French also controlled land in North America. They claimed this area called the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley and the Great Lakes region. This whole area right here was controlled by the French. This area here was controlled by the British. You can see the Spanish had their areas located in the south, west, and in Florida. They call these new lands right here New France. And the Native Americans sided with both the French and the English because they started competing with the French for fur. Like I said, the English and the French both wanted fur. Fur was very valuable in Europe. They kind of were running out of furry animals. There was plenty of furry animals running around North America. The beaver pelts were very valuable. Beaver hats were in style. And so there was a lot of money to be made with the fur industry. It created economic and military alliance between the Europeans and the Native Americans because the Native Americans knew the land. They would trap the furs and trade with European countries. And these alliances dragged the Native Americans into each other's wars. So in Europe, it was a 7-year war, which was between the French and the English. But in America, because of those alliances, it dragged the Native Americans into the war, and that's why it gets the title the French and Indian War. And in 1600s, 1700s, European wars between France and England fueled wars in their colonies. And that's question 2. Just beyond the Appalachian Mountains, the Ohio River Valley began attracting Pennsylvania fur traders. So the British started to move over the mountains into this New France area. As more British colonists arrived in the area, the French feared losing control of their rivers and linked their Canadian Louisiana settlements. So the French were not happy of all the British settlers moving west. So with these tensions mounting, the stage was set for a 9-year French and Indian War. Even though it was called the 7-Year War, it lasted 9 years. The French started sending troops to expel the British settlers and to build forts to protect the region. This upset the Virginia colony, which claimed the land. The governor at the time sent a young British officer named George Washington over to this area to build a small fort and to protect their belongings and their fur trading. He built a small fort called Fort Necessity, and Mr. Washington actually is the reason we started this war because he attacked a French force, and then the French attacked Fort Necessity. Washington retreated to Virginia, and the French-Indian War had begun. So the war began because of George Washington going out to the frontier, building a fort, and attacking. This is the fort that he built called Fort Necessity. And if you had to discuss this, why was this a good name for the fort? If you notice, it doesn't really look like much. They said that George Washington just built a fort because of necessity and used the basic necessities just to get a fort up. Obviously, this is a recreation of what it looked like back during the French and Indian War. During this time of conflict between the British and the French and Native Americans, Benjamin Franklin suggested that the colonists band together for defense. The reason why the Albany Plan of Union is important is because it was the first formal proposal to unite the colonies. Now this will eventually happen in the First and Second Continental Congress when we create the Declaration of Independence, but this was the first time that we tried to unite. It called for each colony to send representatives to the Grand Council. This council will collect taxes, raise armies, and make treaties. This was not successful. The legislators or the governing bodies of the colonies refused to accept the Albany Plan. Now, why was the Albany Plan rejected? The colonial legislators rejected the plan because they didn't want to give up control of their own affairs. They weren't comfortable in coming together as one. They wanted to control what was going on in their colonies and didn't want to give up control, and that's the number one reason why the Albany Plan was rejected. Now, first couple years, the British were, or I should say the American colonies, were not doing well in the French-Indian War, and so the British decided to send money and men to fight in the colonies. The reason is they realized they could not win this war if they relied solely on the colonists. So therefore they sent over some of their top generals and soldiers to help win the battles. One of the key battles in the French-Indian War, which was the turning point of the French-Indian War, was the Battle of Quebec. Quebec sat on a cliff 300 feet above the St. Lawrence River, which made it very defendable. Thousands of soldiers guarded its thick walls, and the British had troubles trying to conquer this fort. They would spend months and months trying to find a passage so they could attack the fort. The reason they are going to be successful was they finally found that steep passage up the cliffs, and the British were able to march 4,000 of his men, and they secretly climbed the cliffs, and then they attacked the British, and they are actually going to win the Battle of Quebec. After the Battle of Quebec, which was a turning point, the British and the French are going to continue fighting until eventually they're going to end the 7-Year War and the French-Indian War with a treaty called the Treaty of Paris. Spain made a pact in 1761 to aid France, but this came too late because by 1763 the British and the French have agreed to sign the Treaty of Paris. Why is it called Treaty of Paris? Is because they were in Paris when they came up with it, and so it got the name Treaty of Paris of 1763, because we're going to have other treaties of Paris in this class. The treaty ended nearly all French control in the North America and dramatically expanded British colonial empire. After the Treaty of Paris, the English and the French negotiated the transfer of land, but they never considered the Native Americans. The Native Americans got the short end of this agreement because their lands were given away. In the spring and summer of 1763, Native American groups responded by attacking settlers and destroying almost every British fort west of the Appalachians. This rebellion to the English treating them poorly and trying to take their land away was called Pontiac's Rebellion. The British had a brutal plan to deal with this uprising. They gave Native Americans smallpox-infected blankets as gifts. Now, a lot of Native Americans have never experienced smallpox, and so it was deadly to the Native Americans. This started a deadly outbreak of the disease among the Native Americans. 3 years later, they eventually are going to sign a peace treaty with the Native Americans, but Pontiac's Rebellion showed the British how difficult it was going to be to govern their vast new empire, which was going to require the king to send troops and spend money, which will eventually lead to the taxation of the colonies. The Proclamation of 1763 was a way the king could try to separate the colonists and the Native Americans so both sides were happy. And this was an imaginary line, basically the Appalachian Mountains, that said colonists could no longer move west of the Appalachian. And the king was hoping that this proclamation would stop rebellion and fighting with Native Americans. Now, the colonists were not happy about the Proclamation of 1763. They were very angry. See, they thought that they won the right to settle this area because they won the battles. And usually when you win a war, you get the land and the spoils. The British government was angry with the colonists who insisted on settling in the Native American lands, and the French-Indian War gave the 13 colonies their first taste of unity because they're going to start to come together to oppose the king's rule of not allowing them to settle in the West. And eventually We'll find out next chapter he's going to send troops to America to enforce his policies, and as feeling of unity grew, as colonists found themselves in another dispute with Britain, with France no longer a threat, the colonial leaders grew more confident in their complaints. The stage was set for the final conflict between the colonies and Britain. Some key points. These are just main points of the section.